So, the third stage of human development, according to spiral dynamics, is called the red stage. And it starts approximately around 10,000 before Christ. And it's basically the time of the agricultural revolution. It's also the moment that people become really sedentary. And interestingly, it also coincides with some stories that you may remember from the Bible, with Adam and Eve being kicked out of the Garden of Eden. It's about the fall. Now, what is this fall? Well, I mean, Adam and Eve, when they were kicked out of the garden, was this some kind of geographical spot? Probably not. Maybe it's more some kind of metaphorical story for something that happened in human development. Most likely, it refers to the fact that humans were gaining more consciousness. Not that they were some kind of elevated conscious beings. No, not at all. But it is just that the cognitive skills became stronger. And people were really able to start seeing their own immortality. They were able to really think about their own death. And that actually created quite a few consequences, because as a result of that, people started getting out of tune with nature. They stopped believing in the abundance of nature, and instead they started perceiving the resources as being scarce. And because they could not find them in nature, they actually had to start cultivating themselves. So lots of important developments happened because all of this led to the creation of competition, wars, slavery, and so on. Now, it's also the time that settlements started getting bigger. Because in the purple stage, people were living in smaller villages with maybe a few hundred people, and still everybody knew everybody, and everybody was related to everybody. But gradually, these settlements became bigger. And when you already have 1,000, 2,000, maybe 3,000 people, you can already become anonymous. There is less of a social control. You can already become somehow individual. And also there, so every household had an individual responsibility. There was less interaction between the different households within the clan or the kinship. So this red stage of development is what we could also call the start of civilization. Now we glorify civilization, right? We think that we're so civilized and that makes us somehow superior. But what is civilization actually? Civilization means nothing else than turning away from nature. Civilization is about believing that we are stronger than nature, that we can be stronger than God, that we can be stronger than our creator. Basically, we believe that we are able to control the forces of nature. Another important thing that happens during this stage is that there is a gradual shift from matriarchal values to patriarchal values. Now, what were these matriarchal values? Because I spoke about them in the previous lesson already. Matriarchal values are about people interacting with each other, not through competition, but through cooperation, through collaboration, through finding compromise. But suddenly, we start moving to patriarchal values, where it's suddenly all about dominance, power, competition. And this has a huge impact on the way that people are living. And the final thing that I want to talk about before we start looking at sex in this stage is that the role of women actually declines, and there is a very good explanation for that. In hunter-gatherer and horticulturalist societies, it's mainly the women who gather the food for the family, because they are either gathering food or they are working in their little gardens. But suddenly, with the agricultural revolution, you need to work on the land. You need to work with a plow, so you need to work with very heavy animals and with strong machineries. You have to work with a plow. And the women didn't have the physical strength. So what happened was that the men were plowing the field, so the women could sit at home, cook the meal, and even more importantly, take care of the babies, because their role was to have as many babies as possible. And it's actually this agricultural revolution that is at the core of the start of sexual repression and the oppression of women. Now, let's start with looking at marriage and sex. The red stage of human development, so when the agricultural revolution took off and people starting living on their own plots of land, ownership emerged. So suddenly there was private ownership and lots of rules and laws were created. Now, what did people own? Basically, people owned everything that had a reproductive value. So they owned land, they owned the crops that were growing on the land, they were owning the animals, and they were also owning the women, because also the women had a reproductive value. So suddenly, marriage became some kind of legal instrument for property rights. Have you ever wondered why in some societies there is still this custom that when a man marries a woman, he has to come up with some kind of some price for the parents of her? Basically, he is buying a new piece of property. When we're looking at what's happening in church, when a woman walks down the aisle and she's accompanied by her husband, what do we see? It's basically just a transfer of the property rights. It's the father who walks his daughter down the aisle and just passes it on to a new man who's going to own her. It sounds all very romantic now when we go to church, right? And we see this happening, but if we think about it, the oranges are not as beautiful as we might think. Now, this whole property aspect of marriages has also a huge impact on marriage systems and on sex, of course. The first thing is that if a woman is owned, she can only own by one man. So there were no more polyandrous or polygynandrous systems. So there was only monogamy or a man owning several women. What's the impact on sex? Well, first of all, on premarital sex. A very important concept that emerged is that of virginity. There are different reasons for that. First of all, if you own a car, a new car has a higher value than a used car. And it's very bad to compare it that way, but this is how people looked at it back then. A used woman had a lower value than a new woman who had not had any sex yet. The other thing was also that if the woman was not a virgin at marriage, maybe she was already pregnant and maybe she would give birth to a child which was not that of her husband. So then the husband would have to take care and spend his resources on a kid that is not his. The other thing is also that if a woman has already had, let's say, 3 kids, then also her reproductive value is going to decrease because she's not going to bear that many children anymore. And here it's very important to understand that this virginity only applies to women at this stage. For men, it's completely irrelevant. So what about extramarital sex? In the previous stage, both men and women were very much engaged into extramarital sex, and it was a normal part of society. But now this changes. When a woman was having sex out of marriage, it was always bad because she could get pregnant and that would create a problem with regards to the resources. So when this happened, either an informal solution was found between the different parties or the woman was sent back by her husband to her father and they had to take care of her. But quite often there were honorary killings. Now, what about men who had sex with women outside of their marriage? Well, it depended who this woman was. If this woman was married, basically he was violating the property rights of another man. So here they had to find a solution. It could be informal, if not many people knew about it, maybe he had to pay something, but quite often he actually could pay the price with his life. If the man was having sex with an unmarried woman but she was still under a father, an uncle, or a brother. It was very similar. He may have had to pay something, or he may have been killed in very unlikely situations. But another solution was that he might have been forced to actually marry her. Now, what happened if a man had sex with a woman who was actually alone? A woman who was not owned by a man. A woman who was kicked out by her family, who was an orphan or something like that. Very simple. She was nobody's property, so there was no violation of the property rights. What about postmarital sex? Well, for men it was okay. I mean, there was nothing wrong about premarital sex, so why would there be something wrong with postmarital sex, as long as he was the owner of this woman? For women it was a little bit more complex. Theoretically, they could still find another husband, but of course their value, to use a very not so nice way, their value was actually pretty low, so there was not much of a demand for women like that. So there was also a solution for that. Quite often the brother of the deceased husband would take her over, or another man might decide that he wants to support another woman. And this was actually the basis of what would later turn out in Islam to be the basis for the polygamous system. Because basically in Islam, if a man wants to have a second wife, he cannot just take a second wife just like that. No. He has to get the approval of his wife. And if a woman is allowing her husband to have a second wife, it is seen as a very pious act, because it shows that this woman is willing to share the resources with another woman. And actually she can set some conditionalities there. She can say that there cannot be any sex in this marriage with this second woman. So what about prostitution? Well, there was definitely a phasing out of the sacred or spiritual prostitution, but there were still some remnants in religious practices. And for example, you can find quite some references to sacred prostitution in the Middle East in the first millennium before Christ. Most often this was not true secret prostitution that included sexual acts, but it was more some kind of theatrical playing out. And more importantly, this red stage of human development was the start of the true profane prostitution, because women who were not owned by a man, they could not count on some kind of social safety network. They had to find their own way. They were just standing on their own feet. And the only way for many of these women to survive, to get resources, was by having sex with men who were willing to pay them for it. Now, there was no stigma on prostitution. Men who were making use of prostitutes were not looked at in a negative way, but prostitutes were seen in a very bad daylight. Now, what about sexual orientation and gender identity? Most likely, people didn't really think too much about gender identity, but sexual orientation was maybe more of a big issue, because heterosexuality was really the norm, because it's very much linked to the reproductive aspect of sex. But homosexuality was really frowned upon. And the interesting thing is that it was the receptive man who was demonized, because he was carrying out the feminine role, basically, or the female role. Whereas the man who was taking the active role, he was just seen as being a man, so there was nothing wrong about that. Quite sure that there was some lesbian sexuality as well, but there's not much known about that, and most likely it was rather hidden. So what can we say about sexual education? Well, there was definitely a decline. It was not anymore like the era before, where an uncle or an aunt would tell you what you have to do, or that if you're a girl and to become a woman you had to undergo some kind of rite of passage that included some kind of gaining sexual skills. Not at all. Sex was not a taught skill anymore. It was no longer visible because people were just having sex within their own house. There were no public orgies anymore. People didn't talk about it that much anymore. Maybe it was not a taboo yet, but people were definitely getting a little bit quieter about sex. Now, what about sex and spirituality? Well, female fertility or the glorification of female fertility had to take place for masculine fertility. So the female gods were replaced by these potent and strong masculine gods, and you can see lots of depictions with phallic symbols. Also, women no longer were leading spiritual or religious ceremonies. This became exclusively the right or the realm of men. And also many of these sexual rituals were gradually forgotten because they refer too much to the female reproductive power. So let's end with a few words on sexual values and norms. This red stage of human development is the start of sexual repression, but it only applied to women, not to men. But there are some other important things that emerge there. First of all, rape. If you have anonymity, if there's less social control, it's much more easy to sexually abuse a woman and nobody's going to find out, or you're not going to be punished. You'll be able to get away with it. Plus, some people were also very frustrated because there was so much power, the competition between men was so high. And this may also have led to the emergence of what we call now BDSM, sadomasochism. It's very likely that men who were frustrated that they did not have enough power, that they were not able to compete, that there was some kind of subconscious aggression coming out in sex. Another important, very violent aspect related to sex and sexuality is the emergence of castration. The aim of castration is basically to domesticate men, to put them under your control and to make sure that they're loyal to you. And maybe the final thing is that also sexual guilt arises here. And it's very much linked to the glorification of virginity. If a woman was no longer a virgin at marriage, then she had some kind of guilt carrying with her. Now there's one final thing that I want to say here, and it relates to sexual repression. In our society, we completely demonize sexual repression and we think that it's a very bad thing. And indeed, it's not something we should be proud of, but I think we need to place it in its right historical context, and we have to understand that sexual repression was the answer to a problem.